challenge for us in Nevada is getting access to wireless broadband, you name it, in our rural areas for so many needs, where we can bring telemedicine, we can bring education, we can bring behavioral services through broadband wireless to those areas. And thank you for your comments. I'm curious if there's any other areas where you can see that we should be looking toward to incentivize and bring additional services through wireless, through spectrum, that we should be looking at to those rural areas. I know you addressed it with access to 600 megahertz. Was there anything else that we should be looking to do to enhance the ability to bring those services to our rural areas?
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Reaching rural areas does require creativity, and as I mentioned, the wireless industry invested $32 billion last year to try to build out and improve its networks. Just to assure you that we continue to expand that coverage footprint. Just over the last 2 years, we added 800,000 road miles to our coverage and over 500,000 citizens. So we continue to make that a priority, but you're right, we have to be creative. In addition to, creating incentives to share spectrum, and that happens today in the marketplace. Verizon has a very successful LTE in rural America program where it shares spectrum with smaller companies that serve rural areas. Incentivizing that is incredibly helpful. Having a robust mobility fund is important. So we commend the FCC for adopting a mobility fund at its last open meeting and look forward to that implementation. I would say, particularly in Western states, siting on federal lands is a real opportunity where today it can take 2 to 4 years to site on federal lands. If we could speed that up, you reduce the costs, you make it easier to get out there and serve citizens who might be near areas with lots of federal land. So those are just a couple ideas.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Cortez Masto. And, I kind of felt like I would get a turn if we proceeded in this fashion. Let me start with you, Mr. Heiner. What's the takeaway in terms of federal policy coming out of this committee with regard to the unlicensed spectrum? Do we need to leave it like it is? What do we need to do? What decisions do we need to make from a legislative standpoint or from a standpoint of giving advice to our regulatory friends?
Well, a couple of points. I was mentioning a minute ago, and so I won't repeat it at length now, but we do need to encourage the FCC to enable unlicensed spectrum in the low bands, the mid bands, and the high bands. There are a couple of FCC proceedings that are open, and we look forward to their conclusion. In the incentive auction, for instance, which was a success in that 70 megahertz was made available for licensed use and 14 megahertz for unlicensed use. We just need to finalize that and get the repacking of the broadcast stations done and try to do that in such a way that there are new unlicensed channels open that are open in every part of the country, including urban areas, so that the device manufacturers for TV white spaces devices will know that if they sell their device, it can be purchased and used any place. There are some open proceedings, I believe, also relating to 2.4 gig and 5 gig, and then also up in the millimeter bands. And so we need to see all of them sort of concluded in ways that encourage the unlicensed use. And the only other point I would make is, it's important that we all work together in the unlicensed space to prevent interference to other users of the same frequencies. And it's important that regulation not be so onerous that the effect of it is actually to block people from using the unlicensed spectrum. So we just need to find the right balance there.
Okay. Well, let me shift. I may ask other members of the panel if they'd like to weigh in on that issue. But first, let me talk about another aspect of your testimony, and that is the data centers that constitute the cloud. Where are these data centers located? I understand a lot of them are right outside town here. And how safe are they? How safe is their infrastructure? And then I'll ask other members of the panel to volunteer if they'd like to weigh in on either of these matters.
Well, thank you for that question. We have.
It's not up in the air somewhere, is it?
Yeah, it's
a big old building.
Well, what happens is people used to go to the whiteboard and say, like, we're going to connect to a server someplace, and they would draw like an image of a cloud, and then it became, that's the cloud. The data centers are on the ground. They're massive.
This could be front page news tomorrow.
They are massive buildings with just racks and racks and racks of servers. We have one in Washington State on the Columbia River, and the idea is to get hydroelectric power, which is cheap and efficient. But we have about 100 data centers around the world. We try to have them, close to, spread around the world to reduce latency, so that, we have a very fast connection to customers wherever they are. These are highly secure facilities. People sometimes worry about, if my data is in these facilities, are they safe? Is it safer if I keep the data at home? And our point of view is really that it's sort of like, is your data safe? Is your money safe in a bank, or is it safer, under the mattress? And actually, it's safer if it's professionally managed. And so, we put tremendous resources into ensuring the security of those systems.
If somebody launches a rocket-propelled grenade at my bank, I'm not going to lose my money. What if they attack the fibers that connect to these data centers? And also help me out. Where are the bulk of them? You tell me where yours are, but answer if you could answer those two.
Well, they are spread around the world. And in terms of the effect of an attack on any one data center, all the data is replicated, and backed up in a professional way to many other locations. And so that shouldn't be a concern. And in terms of where they're located, it really is all over the world. The leaders in running these data centers, of course, are Microsoft, Amazon, which has Amazon Web Services, and Google. And, they all have their own policies on where they site them.
Okay. Is there any other member of the panel who'd like to talk about either unlicensed spectrum or the data centers that comprise the cloud? Mr. Stroop, were you raising your hand?
Actually, I was. This is somewhat related to the question relating to the information in the cloud. Is the one member on the panel whose members provide service above the cloud. That is one of the great advantages in times of emergency, is that infrastructure is protected from the kinds of attacks that you mentioned, or natural disaster. So while not directly going to the point that you had raised in terms of data in the cloud, it does go to the security of the information and the communications networks.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bergman.
Chairman Wicker, just to the question about providing both licensed and unlicensed spectrum, we believe that's important as well, too. The wireless industry relies on unlicensed spectrum and looks to launch new services in unlicensed bands. I would just encourage this committee to continue to focus on the needs for licensed spectrum as well, too, particularly as we look towards 5G. We're looking for high bands as an initial platform for 5G services. And so one of the things that we want to make sure is that we have enough high band spectrum in large channels, large contiguous channels. So even after the FCC adopted its Spectrum Frontiers order last year, there are now 14 gigahertz of spectrum for unlicensed use in the high bands, and just under 4 for licensed spectrum in the high bands. So we really want to make sure that we have enough spectrum there so that we can invest. Again, the industry is looking to invest $250 billion over the next 7 years, creating 3 million jobs, really enabling us to take that 5G lead. So we'd just encourage you all to prioritize both of those.
What if any recommendations do you have to the FCC in this regard?
Sure. We would certainly
You're
love
here
it.
on television. And
we'd love it if the FCC would move forward with its further notice, where it's teed up 18 additional gigahertz of high-band spectrum that could be used for 5G services. And we really want to make sure that the FCC prioritizes licensed spectrum and make sure that we have enough to maintain that leadership as we move from 4G into 5G.
All right, Mr. LaPlatney. You emphasized next-gen TV in your testimony. What needs to happen at the federal level to help your goals become a reality?
Thank you for the question, Senator Wicker. There is an NPRM out there currently. I believe we're in a comment period. And I think the short answer to your question is just continued oversight by this committee. It would be the hope of the industry.
That would be a notice of proposed rulemaking.
Correct. I'm sorry. A notice of proposed rulemaking. Thank you. At the FCC. We're in a comment period now. We expect that comment period to end sometime during the summer, and it would be our hope that the standard would be adopted sometime during the fall.
Have you made recommendations? Have you responded to this notice with suggestions?
Yes, sir. I think a number of industry participants have.
Anyone else? Okay. Mr. Bergman, many industries are leveraging digital platforms for innovation and growth in healthcare. It's a very exciting area in which we're actually helping people lead longer and more meaningful lives. In Mississippi, there's a great example of this called the Diabetes Telehealth Network. It provides patients with remote care management, resulting in cost savings of over $300,000 for only 100 patients. Of course, we would like to write this large. If expanded, this program could save Medicaid $189 million. How do we ensure that there's sufficient spectrum available to continue to fuel this innovation in telemedicine and provide quality health care access to all Americans, regardless of where they live?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we certainly agree with you. mHealth is one of the most promising applications that 5G looks to bring, whether we're talking about remote patient monitoring, chronic disease management. There are tremendous opportunities to save costs, as you mentioned, but to also improve outcomes, to save lives and make sure that patients have a better quality of life. So just a couple of things that this committee can do, again, focusing on making spectrum available in low, mid, and high bands, making sure that we have licensed spectrum that enables us to provide those guarantees of performance, that reliability and security that we really want to have out of our health applications. And then maybe a sometimes overlooked aspect is infrastructure siting, particularly as we look at to build out high band spectrum, which will have that incredible capacity, 5 times the responsiveness, 10 times the speeds of what we have today. It's important that we have this new 5G infrastructure. And so being able to site those small cells quickly and without unnecessary costs or delays is really important.
Thank you. Anyone else want to talk about telehealth? Yes, sir, Mr. Heiner.
Just one additional comment, which is that the TV white spaces technology could also be very helpful for telemedicine because it has the capability, as I mentioned earlier, of sending signals over long distances. And in fact, Microsoft has a system up and running in Botswana where circumstances can be difficult, specifically focused on telemedicine. And in this way, the doctors in the more urban areas are able to reach out to patients in rural areas.
Okay. Now, the administration believes, and I support in certainly a general sense, the idea that regulations, many times, though well-intended, have stifled job creation, and that we need regulatory reform, not only from the standpoint of legislation, but also coming out of the administration. So would each of you 5 experts give us the benefit of some recommendations, 2 or 3 recommendations that the administration, that you might send to the administration for regulatory reform in the early months of this administration? Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just a couple of thoughts. Certainly 2 places where we would appreciate this committee's guidance are with respect to the privacy regulations and the open internet regulations that the past FCC adopted. In the case of privacy, where the FCC departed from long-standing FTC precedent. In the case of Title II, where public utility regulation was applied to broadband services. Both of these areas are places where we believe the committee can help guide the FCC. A third area is, as we look forward towards things like the Internet of Things, making sure that we have a consistent national framework to guide innovation in that space is very important for the future growth of those services.
Okay, well, let me make sure I understand what you're saying with regard to Title II. Is your view that the FCC made a mistake in that regard in recent years, and that should be turned around?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We're certainly very encouraged to hear Chairman Pai talk about reversing that decision and recognizing the competition and the innovation that's happening in the mobile broadband space.
All right, Mr. Antner.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. In my opinion, the American people have benefited tremendously from a light touch regulatory approach to telecom and technology in general, and the growth speaks for itself. I think we should return to light touch regulation and make it possible for companies across the whole competitive environment to compete with each other. Competition is really the lifeblood here of the industry, and Americans have benefited tremendously from it. And I think that's the importance, is that the same rules apply to everybody the same way, no matter how they compete with each other with similar services.
So, with regard to returning to light touch, would you agree with Mr. Bergman then on the Title II issue?
I would.
All right. Now, members of the public should know that the panel is a panel suggested by both the Republican and Democratic membership of this committee. This is not a one-sided show at all. Would anyone care to take issue with either Mr. Bergman or Mr. Antner with regard to the Title II issue? All right. Well, then, what suggestions do you have back to the broader general question about suggestions for policymakers, the administration, the Congress, or the regulators with regard to regulatory reform?
So I would just focus on unlicensed spectrum, which is already a success story in terms of the very low regulation that those bands entail. That low regulation means that barriers to entry for innovators are incredibly low. Anybody can, dream up some device and transmit on the frequencies with almost no regulation. So I would just urge, the Congress and the FCC to continue to maintain that approach, which is a proven success, and expand to the extent possible, the amount of bandwidth available to unlicensed spectrum. On the net neutrality point, I would just say that Microsoft very much supports the core principles of net neutrality, would like to see it enshrined. However that's done, the specifics around Title II is not something that's at all important to us. Mr. LaPlatney, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Senator Wicker. The broadcast industry is highly regulated, and we would love to see the FCC take up local ownership rules, local media ownership rules. We think there's, whether it's the newspaper or broadcast press ownership or the local duopoly rule, we think that those rules, it's time for those rules to be revisited. So that would be our suggestion.
And Mr. Stroop.
Yes, first I'd like to commend the FCC for many of the modifications they made to the Part 25 rules last year, working with the industry. However, we would like to see them make some modifications to the restrictions on the industry that were adopted in the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding on where we can locate our Earth stations. Of course, going to the core of this proceeding, ensuring that there's sufficient spectrum made available for the growth of the industry. Another area that we would recommend relates to export reform. Fortunately, a number of the ITAR restrictions were removed, allowing manufacturers of satellites to export and compete in the market on a worldwide basis. But there were some restrictions that remain with respect to Earth imaging, and we would request that be revisited.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Schatz, I've tried my best to stir up a disagreement among these panelists, and I'm having an awful time doing it. So I'll yield to you for a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you need disagreement, I think I could provide it for you. My additional question is for Mr. Bergman. The U.S. has been a global leader in the development of mobile technology, and there has been a lot of anticipation for the implementation of 5G. In fact, the committee passed Mobile Now in January, which will make additional spectrum available for 5G networks. My question for you, Mr. Bergman, is can you put this in a global context in terms of how we are viewed in the highly competitive world of international technology companies and why it's so important for the United States to lead on 5G?
So thank you, Senator Schatz. We are clearly recognized as the world's leader in 4G LTE. We invested first, innovated first, and that's paid dividends over the last 7 years. If you look at the mobile ecosystem, the two largest operating systems are both based here in the U.S. Stunning 76% of apps developers are located here in the U.S. So we think it's paid tremendous dividends in terms of innovation. We believe that 5G has the same or greater opportunities as we look at these services that have much greater capacity to impact industries across the economy and our consumers' lives. So there truly is a global race. I mentioned some of the other countries around the world that are taking steps to make large swaths of spectrum available and to streamline the way that they site that infrastructure and architecture. So it's really critical that we do the same here in the U.S.
Can you flesh out what those new opportunities are as opposed to the last iteration?
Sure. So, if we look at healthcare, you look at the opportunity to have remote patient monitoring or chronic disease management, or as you look at the ability to use high-band spectrum, we have the opportunity to have Ultra HD. So you might have remote surgery and to be able to extend the reach of expert doctors beyond urban centers into rural areas. Similarly, in the education space, where you might have virtual reality applications that allow students in Hawaii to, in a blink of an eye, to be in the center of the Roman Colosseum. There are tremendous opportunities, and in transportation, in energy as well, too, where we have the ability to cut traffic times, reduce fatalities, cut emissions. There are tremendous opportunities associated with that.
So could you give me a status report? Where are we? Who are our greatest competitors? Who's on top of this? Are we already behind? Or just tell me where we are.
I think we're really poised to lead. The FCC's actions to make that high-band spectrum available have led to over 24 trials here in the U.S. Companies have already invested in R&D, so we're out ahead of the standards process. One of our member companies announced just earlier this week a pilot program to offer 5G services in 11 different markets. So I think we're very much poised to lead. But it is a race, and it will be important that we make the right policy decisions here.
Who are we in a race with?
Japan, the EU, South Korea, China.
Thank you. Anyone else care to comment on that? Mr. Entner.
Thank you, Senator. I want to highlight the importance of configuring the spectrum in large channel configurations, because think of these channels as like water pipes, and the bigger the pipe, the faster the speed. In the United States, spectrum is typically allocated in 5x5 or 10x10 megahertz channels. Overseas, it is in 20x20 megahertz channels very frequently. And inherently of how you can provide for speed is you have now carrier aggregation, where you essentially can glue 3 of these pipes together, 3 of these channels. And if you glue together 3 5x5s, gives you 15 megahertz of spectrum as one channel. Or you glue together 3 20x20s, that's 60. Inherently, whoever has the 20x20s will be 4 times faster. And that is a really important consideration to keep the U.S. Competitive with the rest of the world.
And is one of our sort of unique challenges the spectrum currently allocated, I think, appropriately to national security and other needs that maybe not every country has quite that obligation and quite that same public policy?
It is within the existing spectrum, not necessarily about different and new spectrum. It's just like when we have spectrum, how do we divide up that spectrum?
Oh, this is within the bands that are allocated.
Correct.
And so how does it, is that an FCC decision that has to be made, or are these technical changes that can be made at the operating level?
Initially, it's an FCC decision of how they are allocating the spectrum. If through pure happenstance a company wins several licenses in the market and they lie next to each other, they can create this. But that doesn't happen very often. So through regulatory foresight, this problem can be alleviated.
Okay, thank you very much. A question for Mr. LaPlatney. I want to talk to you about the next gen TV. You know, I understand the transition that was made from analog to digital, and the consumer benefits, the economic benefits, and the need to sort of subsidize that transition. As a television watcher, I can understand the desire for better and better TV, more and more sort of cross-platform utility, and sharper resolution. But I'm not yet persuaded that this is as fundamental of a shift as the analog to digital shift was. And I want to be persuaded of how revolutionary this technology is, because I'm not there yet. So give me your best shot.
Well, so I think the best way to explain it, you know, is the points we talked about earlier. So there's the ability in this standard to better target emergency warnings, including turning on devices, which I think is so far removed from what we can do today. I think that's a much larger step than the analog to digital. I think also the standard, because of the hybrid IP broadcast architecture.
Can I just interrupt there?
What's that?
Okay, let me just interrupt there. So what you're saying is, I've got a device on my nightstand, and suddenly there's a tornado. So what happens?
So we could alert your phone.
So it turns my phone
on.
Okay.
If it has power.
Okay.
It would turn your phone on, and there would be an alert that would come up and say you are in the path of a storm, or you're in imminent danger. Take cover immediately. In fact, the tornadoes that went through Hattiesburg back on the 21st of January, if we'd have had that technology, I believe we could have saved some lives.
So nobody has that technology now?
That technology is, we can alert but this technology allows us to target much more effectively. So, as an example,
on C-SPAN.